think I'm done with my event store, kata thingamajig. So I feel somewhat accomplished.
It's pretty easy to finish when you find out that you wrote it before, huh?
Yeah. I think my last checkout comment or my last check-in comment is I had to clean up after I finished. It was a sexual innuendo or whatever. Anyways, you get it.
Yep.
What's going on with you?
Oh, not much. Mostly trying to do anything while I watch the election results come in. So it's
It looks like
has an
you're about to have
impossible.
a new president.
Yeah, that's what it looks like. It's not guaranteed at this point, but it's what it looks like.
The question is your president going to call for a civil war and
No,
a coup?
that's all just stupid hype. That's bull crap.
Is that
And
what people
besides,
were actually saying? Because I don't really watch TV. I'm just
no,
given his personality. I don't see him just giving up power and just accepting the people's vote. Well, I see him saying, nope. There's the system is flawed. There's the state of whatever. They didn't like me, so recount. Wasn't this the same thing with Al Gore and George Bush back in the early 2000s?
not really. It's not the same so much. It was just really close some there, and they wanted to do a recount to make sure it was all valid or whatever. But
Yeah.
The I think most of that's just a narrative. If you look at it, I don't think anybody, reasonably on the Trump side of things thinks he's not going to give up the presidency or call for a civil war. And frankly, it's none of the people that follow him probably would do anything anyways. He has no backing in terms of extreme violence like that against other Americans. It's not what Trump supporters stand for. They're not rioters and looters. There's definitely people out there that would do it. I'm not saying there isn't. There are radical people out there. It's just the vast majority that you would need to actually do like an actual coup like that. No. Yeah. So this is all just a huge narrative that the media in general puts into your people's brains about Trump voters. Just like we're racist, so racist.
Yeah, I haven't really been digging into media opinions. I was just saying it as a joke.
Yeah, well, no, there's people who seriously believe he's just gonna, hunker down and not leave and stuff like that if it does go bad. And I don't see that happening. He puts strong rhetoric out there because he needs to in a lot of cases to at least try to combat some of the rhetoric that goes against him. But if you, like I said, if you get rid of all of this stuff up here and you look at his actual real actions and things that he's taken, they're not there isn't anything crazy that he's done. It's rhetoric, which is a tool. It's a tool of persuasion, and I think people who understand, a lot of people understand that about Trump.
So, did you write your Hello World elixir yet?
Oh, I've written hello a few times and fizz buzz and stuff like that. I was going to work on some stuff last night, but about 3:00, a construction company down the street cut the fiber line to my house or to this area. And so I didn't have internet all last night. And I realized in that if I don't have internet, boy, I'm pretty much dead in the water in terms of coding anything.
Caveman.
Yeah, because you can't get packages, you can't look up documentation. It's kind of necessary. So.
What were you asking who in my coding session like 15 minutes ago?
I was just being kind of dumb, but when you came in and you said, I'm going to contact him, but I realized it was the Dark Lane guy. So.
Yeah, I still got to read his blogs. I read like one about them moving to F sharp, but he has one about why they didn't choose Rust, one about why they were leaving OCaml. I want to read them. I never really heard of him, but I mean, he sounds like a prolific writer. So yeah, he got like 7,000 followers. I just wrote him a DM, pretty much asking for a job. I'm not sure if they're hiring though.
Yeah. Well, I like the idea of what they're talking about with it, is that they're trying to remove all this additional complexity that we put into software development. But I don't know that it's approaching it quite in the right way. But because I mean, you still have to think about, I don't know. Like I was saying to you, in terms of if I was going to try to write a tool, it would be focused on how do you model the domain in a tool, because that's really the most important part. And so getting the domain, the data modeled out, and the operations modeled out, and capturing language and descriptions and all of that stuff first. And then saying, okay, how do we make it as simple as possible to do ports and adapters into that? And then build out from there. So that's where you get into particulars about HTTP and all of that stuff. But their Hello World starts with you've made an API, and it approaches it from a different angle. So, I mean, I could imagine like you could have some of that, but it really should almost be just mostly generated or implied from whatever you define within your core domain, or within a layer outside your core domain, with if you wanted to define, here's how the ports work, and then just have endpoints be processed from that. So, but yeah, I don't know. I've sat down a few times to try to think through how that would work, and I like, I think because I like to do modeling first, but I don't have a clear understanding of like how would I do the modeling I want to do in Elixir yet. So
you gotta get Dialyzer, or is that deprecated?
No, Dialyzer's there. From what I understand, that's just a static analysis tool that works with the specs that are already in there. Type specs. So type specs are an actual core part of the language, but Dialyzer sits on top of that and says, okay, given what you've type spec, does this all check out? So, and it might even already be in the plugin for Visual Studio that I'm using, because it gives a lot of spec information.
A side benefit is to escape the cult of Rich in the Clojure community. Rich Hickey's cult. He's a cult leader. Steve Jobs is a cult leader, or was. You can't say he wasn't. Yeah, I want to read this, man. Anyways. Oh, how do I stop sharing? Yeah, man, you need to expedite your learning, and you need to have some open source repos, put it out so people can code review it, troll it, link to it on, what's that thing called that everybody is on except me? Reddit, right?
Yeah, I'm not on Reddit either. I think the problem is that with C# anyways, like I have a fairly methodical way of thinking about code and getting it put together and stuff like that. I just don't have that same frame of reference, but I'm inclined to try to do the same process there, and it's not going to work for me. So I literally need to do is say this first iteration, if I'm going to build something like this, is going to be a dirty, messy, mess, and just literally hack it out for the purposes of learning, and not actually feeling. Then come back around when I'm smarter and understand the problem of what I'm trying to do better, then actually solve it for real. So, but it's really difficult coming from a place where you know your pattern and how to process things already, and having to do all of the same stuff over again. And there's really not that much different. I mean, there's some things that are nicer in Elixir, and there's things that are nicer in C#, but I don't know. I am getting a bit hung up on like the concept of like a lot of everything that I do in terms of application code and in .NET world is based around dependency injection as a core tenet. And it's
I'm not a fan of it. I'm rewriting my client's solution. Like, I mean, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I don't like it. Do I think does it have advantages? Yes. It's just, I don't like the static statiness of it, and how you always have to account for it in your teardown with automated tests. Like, I don't like it, man. And like, the killing part, this is me venting, is people will, within their code behind for if we're talking about a mobile app like Xamarin, within their app.xamarin.cs, they'll have 100 lines, 150 lines of all these registrations, right? But they don't have any tests. So like, why are you doing an IOC container and you don't have any tests? Like, what is the point of doing it? Is it just to do it so you could say that you use dependency injection? Like, what's the point of using dependency injection if you don't have any tests? Like, I don't get it.
Yeah, well, there is some benefit in terms of what makes testable code with dependency injection and mocking in that terms also makes the code flexible in terms of swapping in a different provider along the lines, or along the way without much work. So you're coding to a spec, right? That's what an interface is. And you're just doing dependency injection to do all of the construction of what you need, and only what you need, so you don't have to do that manually.
Okay, let's.
Or no, you're not using a dependency injection. You're using IOC.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, yeah. I don't like IOC containers. Like, because dependency injection is literally what you said. Like, I mean, I do it.
Sorry, yeah. Well, it's a DI IOC container. But dependency injection, I'm assuming you're doing it in F#. But maybe so. Do you do like function injection? Do you do? I mean, or do you? So if you're going to make something that has like maybe I'll frame it this way. Let's say you have a endpoint that you need to talk to Twitter or GitHub or something or whatever, and that could change over time, where you'd want to put different providers in there or different things, and then you've got some core logic depends on some domain core logic that wants to depend on that particular type of endpoint, but abstractly. Like there, another one we could say is database or whatever. What's the mechanism that you generally use to separate those concerns, or to make it so that you wouldn't have to do a find and replace everywhere to say make this the Twitter from Twitter or whatever to something else?
Are you asking how do I accomplish that in the FP language, or how do I accomplish that, period?
In an FP language, but imagine if you didn't have what I don't know interfaces, but I think there's ways to do it in Elixir. I've looked it up. I just don't know if it's idiomatically correct. So maybe general
it's
FP.
You're using currying. So currying basically lets you assign a function to a value, but that function is partially filled out.
Yeah.
But it's still on that value, and you're responsible sometime down the road to pass in the last remaining value or values in order for it to execute.
I thought that was partially applied functions, and I thought currying was more like an automatic function creation based on not providing. But anyways, regardless, so what you're saying is
partial function application, but I think the two are like
it's kind of like DI and IOC. They're used kind of interchangeably, but they're not. So you're doing because you're doing dependency injection then, but you're doing function injection at that point then, right? Just not an object injection or whatever. So
I think the term is high order functions or something like that. So like for my client, it's all for one of my clients, it's C#. So like I'm just not using IOC containers. I'm like literally just passing in values to the constructor.
Yeah, no, I mean in your like functional world more.
In functional, I don't use IOC containers. I use a record in which the properties point to function types. And so when I'm bootstrapping the application, I have this record called a API, and it'll have a list of functions that are responsible for, or it has a list of properties that are responsible for strategies on getting information from various endpoints, potentially. And they're just function types. And so depending on runtime, I either pointed to my test API or I pointed to an actual integration API that's hitting some servers.
Yeah, so that record type is...
I'm using a record with function type properties on them.
Yeah. So that's what you're using to define essentially your interface, your spec for it. Okay. Yeah, that's stuff like this where I get hung up because I want to I know what I want to do, but I want to do it idiomatically correct within the language the first time. But maybe there is no idiomatically correct way to do it. I read some articles on this, and function injection or whatever was one path, but there's also within Elixir you can at compile time essentially. Actually, I suppose it's at runtime even. You can get from like a configuration what the implementation is supposed to be. So you can say like application, give me what's configured for this variable, and you can have like a module name behind that, so you can point it to the correct module.
Oh yeah.
Or a function, whatever.
So basically, my workflow is try to think about it like this: you have a specification for how things are supposed to get done, and then you have interpreters that interpret what it means for it to get done. Right? Maybe I said that backwards. You have a specification that says what needs to be done, and then you have interpreters that basically deem how it's supposed to be done. Okay, you're going to have two interpreters if you're me, right? You're going to have your test API, which is a mocked out server, right? It's imitating a server. That's what it's doing. This test API is what's feeding your unit test information, and it's what your unit tests are relying on without hitting a server. Okay, so your test API is one interpreter. Your other interpreter is, I call it a data gateway, right? Per domain has its own data gateway, which is a dedicated library for hitting a server, for getting information that it needs, or for posting commands to an external server. So test API, data gateway are the two libraries, depending on if you're if you're doing integration or if you're just doing like business logic testing, aka unit tests. But that said, when you have this record, that when you have your API structure that's in the form of a record, you're going to have different properties that represent different operations for what it will require from an external dependency, right? Again, your test API is modeling an external dependency or mimicking the external dependency. Your data gateway is a client to an external dependency. So your API structure that you're injecting to various functions or objects, each of its properties are going to be mapped to functions on either your test API or your data gateway.
Yep. Yeah.
Does
And
that
that's
sound kind of clear?
Yeah. Yeah. Like I think of it in a different way in terms of where I'm coming from, but it's the same concept. So I've really fallen into this hexagonal or ports and adapters architecture and thinking about everything in terms of there's a core domain and everything else is either, as a port and adapter kind of a thing, or rather is an adapter. So like I've gotten into the point where in my C# projects, like I might have a project that is a particular client to a particular endpoint. Like so let's say you're going to talk to Twitter. Like I'd take Twitter and if I actually needed to have the library like mapped out, I would build a client for it. Or if I need to talk to GitHub, although those have libraries usually that you can just import. So those are probably bad examples. But let's say an API that is internal that doesn't have a published NuGet package or whatever that I want to hit with a RESTful endpoint. Or if there's a database with schema that I need to define, like I'll put those into separate projects in C#. And then I've gotten into the habit of having almost having like an adapters project, although sometimes I name it slightly different. That's purely to map between whatever domain representation I have of that endpoint into the actual endpoint. So it's just purely mapping activities or whatever. And sometimes you need to make composite. Sometimes I need to do composite adapters where I'm calling a couple different endpoints and mapping them into one logical thing.
Yeah.
And then the core logic, like it has its core domain logic and processes and operations, but then it has these interfaces that define inbound and outbound ports basically. So and then so those interfaces live within the domain. They're used by code in the domain. Their implementations are all injected in. So it's the same kind of thing. And I would do that for testing on the domain too then, right? So I'd inject whatever implementation that I want to put behind the interface that is in the domain. So, but yeah, I think the patterns are all pretty much the same, but they're just slightly changed. So yeah. I'm kind of interested in your how when you start a brand new project, and I should probably watch some of your streams from start, the work you do with that language, the language and operations module. So like, I assume you start your development at some sort of domain core and build your way out from there.
Mm-hmm.
What does that process look like for you?
It's my favorite part of programming. So I don't know if you said it or someone else said it, but I basically merge. I bring in the waterfall process, into. How do I frame this? I use waterfall, and I integrate it with the compiler. So what I usually do is I'll immediately, when I'm doing a greenfield project, the first thing I do is add a specification library, and Specification library is going to always have a language and operations. Those are the two main modules. You may have an additional module, which is the API, which would be used for dependency injection, right? Hence what we were talking about 5 minutes ago. Where's scope to this at? Hold up. But I always start off with the specification. And the very first thing I start doing is start figuring out, I don't even think this is being used. The very first thing that I start doing is start figuring out within this domain, what are the core operations that rely on some external dependency, aka a web server. I don't even think this is needed anymore. And so, I mean, this is a poor example right here, this module. But let me see if this even builds. Let's go to a different module or a different specification. After I figure out if I could delete this one. Yeah, this one can be deleted, right? So I could delete you, supposedly. All right, so if I go to the operations over here.
Yeah, so the operations.
This is the event store. I'm listening.
So these operations, these are the things that I think of. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you. Yes, I hear you.
Did that help at all? Hello? Hello?
I hear you. All right, I hear you.
Oh, you do? Oh, geez. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry that you said hello. So those operations then. I can hear you.
Okay.
Can you hear? Okay.
All right. So what were you saying?
I was gonna say, so these are like inbound ports, or what I think of them. So these are your use cases, or is the API into the core domain? Is that a correct way to think about it?
Let's figure out what these terms mean. You say API. What?
A port would be commands or queries. Port would be another way to think of it. This is what a consumer is going to target, right? In some way, shape, or form, because in terms of the domain. These are entry points into the domain. If you're going to model this as like and this is probably a bad example, but if you're going to model this with human beings sitting there, you'd have somebody at a desk. And if somebody walked up and said, I want to create something, they would talk to this person at the desk and say, hey, I want to create something or create a connection.
This isn't really, I think you're referring to like an actor. If you remember like UML, and an actor is going to want to perform the following business workflows. It's not really so much about the actor. It's all these operations that are listed are operations that within a business application relies on the external dependency in order for it to be successful, aka a web server.
So if it's just a
through my experience of like refining this, so none of this is in-memory operations. All these operations that I found in my practice of building business applications, within your operations module of the specification library, they all rely on I/O, not necessarily rendering I/O, but data retrieval.
So if you were going to offer something that was
hosting data,
let's just say that you had a operation or something in your thing where you were doing a complex calculation, but it didn't involve any I/O other than just what came in through the signature there. Would you still model it this way if it was a pure function? But it was going to be consumed by someone else. It was a service that's offered by this thing. So just maybe I'll give an example. Say like you had a
to help me understand. Okay.
So let's say like this service, they talked about one of the things it would do is
latency off or something. Why is there so much?
I don't know, man. maybe when they
I'll say
messed up
something. I'll say something. Yeah, I think our latency is like a couple seconds off. Like, because I'll say something, and then like you'll respond a second and a half later.
Yeah, maybe they messed up my internet speed when they cut the line yesterday. So my download's good. Just looking at a speed test here.
Okay.
Like I'm getting 230 megabits or
All right, so
whatever, and upload is about the same. So I don't know. Maybe StreamYard
I could probably. How do I? Is there a way that I could just stop streaming my video and just share my desktop? Would that make things better? I'm not sure how to accomplish that.
You just do stop cam, maybe. Just do stop cam, maybe. Down there on the bottom. So you got mute, stop cam.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe I'll do the same thing just to see if that helps.
All right. So you're saying that, well, what if you want to build a calculator? Is that what you were trying to say?
Yeah. So you're let's just say you're going to pass in some data and it's going to do a really complex calculation and then return some value. But there's no I/O, so it's pure function. It's not going to fail. Would you still model that as an operation?
Okay. So
not that you probably have
initially I would. Yeah. The short answer, if it's something that is reasonably complex, where there can be where it could be error prone, hence internet connection, where it's not, or where it's not necessarily determined to always be successful, then I feel like I model that as an operation. But like, I mean, I could go through a workflow. Like if you had a calculator, all right, let's say calculator, and I mean, I'm not really a math person, but there's a couple things. And this is probably what you may be interested in, is I'll first start declaring the operations for a calculator. So there's an add, which, well, an add requires two numbers, right? So
yeah.
Number and
I don't know, number typing.
will give you a sum. Is that what an add, or is it called product? I'm not sure. I think with multiplication it's a product, right? But when you add,
is a product, yeah,
it's a sum, right?
Yeah.
But then you could say, well, add is one operation, but there's also a multiply, and well, at the end of the day, you need two numbers to multiply, and that's going to be your product, right? But then you could say, well, does that really matter, or can all these just be numbers? Because at the end of the day, like, does it matter, right? So you start going through an exercise of your language, right? Language, in which you're refining what the domain language is by declaring the operations, and for these operations to be successful, what do they actually need, right?
Yeah. So what is another way to say this is that your language for you is defining what data is there for the most part, because you're not are you defining any sort of because like I think of language and they could describe within their language a particular kind of procedure like add, but that's an operation, but it's also a specific domain terminology when you're talking about, or language, part of the language when you're talking about a calculator, right?
Mm-hmm. So what I found is, and so now we would open up a language module, and so it's kind of like what you said, except a language are only the data structures that's relative to the domain that you're working within. And well, your operations are the actual functions.
Yeah, but perfectly mapped into the domain terms that you're that you're talking about. So somebody says, well, adding, you take a number, you take another number, and you put them to, you add them, and then you get a resulting number. And that's the way that somebody, maybe would describe it. Or like you said, they might say, well, the output's a sum, but maybe that doesn't matter.
Yeah, for me, I would probably, I would initially probably do sum and product. And like I use type aliases, right?
Yeah.
So like, because I rather use the domain terms than a double or an integer or a string, because that can really be anything, but it provides context, right? When I use type aliases.
Yeah. Well, it also prevents, in some cases, it could prevent a lot of errors from happening too. If you have two numbers, but if you needed them to actually be distinct things, if you did it as double, but it also documents it's a documentation task too. It describes exactly what it is. I mean, I don't know how many times I've seen function signatures where it's string, and like, okay, what are these strings? You have to look at the variable names. But at the same time, if you accidentally refactor something and swap those strings around, like you've got to go, and the compiler's not going to tell you there's problems there.
Yeah, but the aliases aren't going to save you from that. But
is that why you might do like a number of double of number or something like that?
There's a couple things that you can do. The approach, what I found in the evolution of my workflow is every operation. I try to have every operation only take one parameter. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if operands is the right word, but basically you would have a type operands equals, and then we just introduce this notion of operand 1 is a number, operand 2 is a number.
That would prevent you from doing currying, though, if you did want to do currying, right? But I suppose behind the scenes you could it separated or structure it differently.
Well,
this is just what you're.
It doesn't prevent you from doing currying.
Can you do currying on a partial? How would you partially apply a tuple?
Hold on for 1 second.
Because
so this is called operands, right? And so you're like, oh no, well you can't do currying. Hold on, why is my sum not showing up? Sum is we didn't.
Product's a double. Sum is a double, right?
It's just a whatever, using a double or whatever.
Yeah, and then you got sum as you have to define sum as well.
Oh, okay. I'm about to answer your question soon.
Oh, that's fine.
So you have that should be resolved now. Okay.
Yeah.
So you have add and you have operands, and then the result is going to be a sum, and then this multiply is operands 2, right? And that's going to give you a product. And you were saying, well, no, how do you do currying? Right?
Oh, you just do it on the other end. Yeah, I just answered. Yeah, never mind. Forget it.
So you could say let add number.
Yep. Yeah. No, I got it.
Okay.
I was stuck in the way that you had described it before because you were passing number into sum. So you had you essentially had single parameter functions chained there, right? So
what you could always do, right, Kirk? Yeah. You have to remember, if you forgot, if you never considered, that unit is still a valid value. You know what unit is or means, right?
Yeah.
So we could say function, boom, boom, right? And then we could say, and I guess we could call this V1 and V2. And then you could say V1 plus V2.
Yeah.
And, well, what am I doing wrong here?
Yeah. No, I get it though. We don't have to dig into this. I got it, but I'm
yeah,
interested to continue on with the discussion of, you said you'd start with it in your operations, but so add and multiply here don't have. Those are core domain operations for sure, and they are part of the language as well. But if you're defining languages as data and operations as operations, that then this split makes sense.
So you could also do this, right?
So you have a function that takes operations and then.
So have you ever seen this type of syntax, which may not be necessary, but you mentioned currying. How would you do currying? Right, that's what you said.
Yeah, and like I said, I think I figured it out.
Okay.
After. And the thing is that operands kind of makes sense. Order of operations within subtraction actually matters, right? Multiplication and addition, they don't, but order does matter within things. So subtraction, but anyways, regardless, that's beside the point. That's just a technical detail of this, and I don't really care too much about currying, but I had my brain triggered something funny there. So, but anyways, to get back to the question at hand, though, so you have add and multiply. Those are core operations. But they don't have any side effects. They don't have any I/O, but they would still exist here, correct?
So hold up. So you have your let add right here,
Mm-hmm.
and so then if you want that to be curried or partial application, whatever that word is, then you can say let result equal, and then you would say add, and then you would pass in your record, which is the operand thing right here.
Yeah.
So once you would say operand 1 equals 0, operand 2 equals 1, something like that. Equals 1, and it has to be double. All right, so however you do that, I don't know if you cast it to double.
I think it's 0.0. You have to put a decimal, yeah. At least in C# you do.
Something like that. But anyway, that's how you would accomplish it. But then you were asking something else. My bad.
Yeah, no, I was without that, anyways. You got to add and multiply, like I said. Those are your core domain operations for a calculator. They don't have any. They don't have any side effects. They don't have any external dependencies. They're not gonna, assuming that you take away overflows and stuff like that, and don't try to model that out. You're not gonna have any problems. So these are pure functions for the most part. Do you? They still belong here in your modeling terms, though, right? Because they're part of the language. They're part of the core domain. They're inward. They're essentially the ports you're going to offer, the operations you're going to offer to it. So this is correct within your modeling scheme, right? Like,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Like I would do it this way, even though I gave you a whole speech on like my operations tend to model operations that can be error prone, and that usually model dependencies on the external. Well, usually model external dependencies such as a web server. If I'm doing something that isn't connected and is self-contained within the process or processor, then yeah, I will still go this way because it just helps me flesh out the data structures in addition to the core operations. So it's verbs first, noun second, which is different than object-oriented programming, where you usually define the nouns first, hence your objects, and then the behavior second.
Yeah, I'm going through that phase right now. Actually, that helps a lot stating that, because my first inclination with Elixir is to go in and define structs and define the data first. But looking at it from the perspective of, hey, define your actions first, that makes sense. Do you ever model then within that core domain what external, like outbound external dependencies might be, or if that makes sense? So let's say
outbound external dependencies.
Okay,
I'm listening.
So a common thing that I'll do within the way that I model within C# anyways is I will do this kind of a thing where I define essentially these are inbound ports to me. That's how I'm thinking about them. These are the operations, the things that are going to get you into the domain if you're trying to come at it from a consumer perspective. Then within the domain, there's going to be some sort of activity going on, and then there's going to be usually some sort of outbound behavior or retrieval that accesses the outside world. I try to model that as well when I'm doing stuff. So if I know that I'm going to talk to, let's say, the use case overall, would involve grabbing something from GitHub or whatever, a source control provider or something like that. I would model that as a boundary within my domain, in terms of, like, I know it's going to be external to my domain, but I know that I need particular operations to enable these operations to actually function. So do you put those all within your are those all just implementation details in your
okay.
Yeah.
If I think I understand your question, my business logic has no dependency on my domain language and my domain operations have no dependency on third party or external dependencies. Does that answer it?
Yeah. So this is purely a spec defining how you would essentially interact with the library, or with the thing from a domain perspective, in terms of like being a consumer of it.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So what that means is, we're in your domain is something that you own. It's something that no external influence has access to. And so when you start layering, you have a specification, you have an interpreter. Your interpreter is going to rely on the language of your domain, hence these data structures, right? Mm-hmm. It's going to rely on the operations of the domain, right? In which those data structures are the language for those operations to use. But your interpreter is going to hit a Stripe API. It's going to hit a Facebook API. It'll get back the result, but it's responsible for returning. Your interpreter is going to implement these operations. And so regardless of the type of result that it gets back, such as a SQL entity record or, I don't know, anything that is like vendor specific, it doesn't matter. What it needs to return back is operands or authenticated, something that's defined within the language of that domain. So it's responsible for converting whatever third-party results that it receives into the language of the domain in order for it to be used by the business logic. The business logic doesn't know anything outside of the domain. Is that somewhat clearer? So
no, I understand that. That's why I model outbound boundaries too within the domain. So I think of things in terms. You've heard of like the entity component boundary model? Is that what it is? Entity component boundary? No, entity.
I'm not familiar with that term. But yeah, usually if we look at different libraries, I'll create a a utilities library, and I'll shove that under my domain folder, and it's responsible for converting third-party results into the data structures that are defined as my language. So I'm isolating my business logic, aka domain logic, from anything that's external, from the UI layer and from the data gateway layer, right? All that stuff, like those are the details. Those are pushed to the edges. But my domain logic, it has no clue what Stripe API is. It has no clue what third party anything is. All that stuff, it doesn't care about, right? Nor should it.
Yeah.
My view model is going to reference a data gateway, sure, but my view model is not going to care about the third-party dependencies.
Sure, but your domain does.
The data gateway does, and my UI layer does, in which there are two different libraries. But my view model, which is a mediator, and my well, that's pretty much it. I just have my view model. Then I have a data gateway. I don't have any model library added to it.
So just for an example here, like if so like I said, I'm thinking about this in terms of outbound boundaries or outbound ports or outbound things, and whether those get modeled in your specification, or if those just become, because they are parts of the domain, right? You're specifying some external thing to you that isn't core to you, but you have to interact with, right? Part of that is the inbound stuff, which is what services or things do I provide the world, which are the add and multiply within the calculator example. But then there might be something that, like I said, craps out the other end of these operations, that is potentially problematic or has IO or whatever, but is thought of conceptually within your domain. So I'm trying to think of this, like, let's say you're modeling out a package processing facility, right? And somebody comes up to the counter, and in an inbound part of your domain, you've got some sort of operation that's like ship package or something like that, or deliver or drop off. I don't know, ship package, let's say, is the whole use case. And so it starts with somebody on the client side saying, okay, here's a package coming in, here's the contents of it, whatever. You've got all of that data. Then within your domain, there's obviously a bunch of potential processing that might go on with that package, right? But on the outbound, there might be, a truck that's out there that you're going to then, from your domain, it's going to be a boundary to it, right? So it needs to use the logistics system or something like that, shipping or truck system, correct? And it's going to pass data off to that to kind of realize the entire scenario that you're dealing with. And that's kind of it's probably a bad example, because there's obviously going to be multi-steps within the domain itself. But do you get where I'm saying there? That
you're explaining a saga, right?
Yeah, that would be a saga, but maybe this is probably a bad example. Let's say you had here's another example. Let's say you had a operation that receives data in from a client, does code generation, let's say, and then spits it out to GitHub on the other end automatically.
Okay.
So you've got a clear operation coming in. Let's say it's just generate code or whatever, and or.
So hold up. You said that there's some user input that comes in. I don't know what this operation is going to be. Some operation.
Yeah, it's some code.
Or you said it was posting to post to server, like that.
And
what?
So you're getting some user input, and then what happens is that, you yourself, you're just going to get a receipt that it's successful or not. The internals of the actual domain logic is to generate a code with that data that you have, your submission, and then it's going to post that to a provider, some sort of source code provider. Let's say this is probably a better example.
Okay.
That relationship between your domain and that external source code provider, where do you model that?
So let's call this GitHub, right? Or GitHub client, right?
GitHub. Yeah.
And so you're saying that we're going to post some submission. We're speaking in abstract terms, right? And you're going to get some type of confirmation about what you posted. And I guess, well, let's be specific. You're posting code, right?
So the idea is let's just say that this is a code generation utility. That's what I was getting at. Okay. You commit in some data structure that defines some, let's just say it's a model, right? It internally is going to do code generation. What it does in there doesn't matter, but that's not what it's going to give you back. It's going to do the code generation, and then it's going to post that into a repo for you.
Okay.
So from your relationship as a person to this thing, it's what you're doing is you're getting a submission, and all you're doing is getting back some sort of receipt that it's done or it's started, or at least, right? Like, hey, thank you.
Yeah,
I've successfully recorded the fact that you want this done. And it could do it synchronously, it could do it asynchronously, whatever.
Okay.
But it's going to do it. Now, like I said, internally, the actual domain logic is to generate code and then send it to a source control provider. Now, that source control provider, the concept of it is part of your domain, right? The concept of, I have a source control provider that's going to take the output of my calculations and is going to put it into some repo. Do you model that in these things? Do you model those external boundaries in your specification? That's basically the question I'm trying to ask.
I don't think I do, because within the operations module, I don't think I do. I think that I embed that information into my submission. So my submission would be something that probably looks like, let's say type submission equals, and it'll be a record, and well, it probably needs an endpoint, right? And maybe your submission, I don't know what else the submission needs. It is supposed to be code generation. Is it supposed to be code, right?
Yeah.
All right, whatever that means. One can argue that maybe submission can be anything, and we can make it generic, right? So we could just say, call it data. And so then your code would be data, or actually this would be called data, like that. And so, like, I would leave it up to the interpreter to figure out what to do with the submission.
Okay. Right? I think I got it. I think I got it. So this is purely, like I said, what you're modeling here is purely a spec for consumer interaction. It's not. You might have another place where you model out how those within that, what external things you're interacting with, but that doesn't belong here in your summation. Like they might have to take data in that accounts for that, but it's not going to. Like I said, so in C# land, what I would do in some cases I'll define like an interface that says, okay, here's essentially the specification for interacting with this library. In the same way that you've got the operations here, I'd have something like that probably, sometimes anyways. Or I'd have a like a facade class that handles this operation and dispatches it off. But it defines essentially, this is how you use the library. In theory, it could be the only thing that's public about your domain, right? Internally, though, to the domain, I'll also have, like, in this case, I would model out a boundary of being like, there's some source control provider. So I would define what interactions my domain's going to have with that source control provider to realize the thing. But that doesn't belong here in your terms, is what I'm gathering. Like you wouldn't model out that the domain is going to need a way to submit code to source control provider, because that's not something that as a consumer you are going to do. You're not submitting it to a source control provider. That's just part of the behavior of a submission.
I mean, to be fair, I would probably initially model what you were describing, but just over time, as I've been practicing, I've gotten better at abstracting those details away. So at a high level, any interaction with the server, you're just querying or you're posting, and that's it. And your interpreter can figure out what it means to post, right? So you might have your interpreter say, and like just ignore that for right now, ignore that this is operations module, but you may have an interpreter that says post to GitHub or something. I don't know. And so that might implement this post. Do I really have to include the type parameter in here? And then that would take something, and then we could just say that would be a sync result. But to make long story short, hold up, return there, something like that. Make long story short, hey, I don't have any red squigglies. Okay. Like your interpreter can decide. You can self-document in your interpreter what it actually means, what it's actually doing. But I find that your operations can be pretty generic. But again, when you're trying to figure things out, when you're starting a greenfield project, yeah, you might be really specific, and you may have literally this as the operation. But in my development, I've learned to kind of keep things very abstract and leave it up to the interpreter to decide what that really means. Right? So the interpreter is going to implement this post operation that takes some arbitrary submission, returns some arbitrary confirmation, but it's going to have a function that has a name that fits, what it's really doing. And everything else is going to take this abstraction and assign some meaning to it, right? That's what your interpreter is going to do. In the dedicated library, call it a data gateway or your test API.
Yeah, I think I've got it. Like I said, I think that this in the way that I'm thinking about it is modeling only incoming or inbound boundaries. So the consumer to the domain boundary. So like I said, I think about things in terms, and it was entity control boundary was the term I was, not entity component boundary. I knew that was wrong, but I tend to do within, like I said, modeling within C# land is I'll create interfaces for every boundary that I'm going to need in terms of the domain terms I'm hearing. So, like if I was going to have a idea that the core purpose of a thing is to take code in and post it to a source control provider, and it was going to do that as a thing, I'd have two boundaries. I'd have one boundary that specifies exactly what you had, which is here's the interface between me and the user, or the consumer of the thing, which takes in the code and blah 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 and all that. But then I'd also in mind define an interface that says, okay, as part of this core domain, a core thing that I need to do is talk to some external boundary, source control provider. So I would model interface, source control provider, and I'd put an abstraction around that boundary. So I've got my incoming and outbound boundary. Then I'll have entities and controllers that work within, within that domain area that actually realize whatever scenario I'm trying to achieve. Obviously, everything is triggered by everything. All work is triggered by external inbound boundaries. But I just, like I said, I wondered within your spec if you model who the external actors on the outbound side are, which it sounds like you don't, which makes sense. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying I'm trying to understand what you include or don't include. And this, to me, looks like it's purely just the spec that you talk about is purely the API, not a model of all boundaries.
Things to remember is just you may start off being very detailed in your spec, and then it just gets refined to be more abstract. And I think the goal is to keep things abstract. The more abstract it is, the more usable it is for other interpreters or clients.
Yeah. So that's where it comes down to, like, what I'm thinking with this darklang stuff is that, like, they're starting with implementation details, like your HTTP server, right, as your endpoint, and you're building it out there. Like, I just wonder if you could take the same concept, and I know this is kind of like what UML was trying to do with code generation, and I think that maybe it was before its times in terms of capability. I don't know, but I could imagine a world where you do this kind of a thing first, is you're actually modeling the domain in terms of here's the operations that need to happen, here's the concepts that need to happen, and map it purely to domain. So it's do the fun part, right? Where you're modeling this within a tool like darklang, or it could have been any sort of UML tool, I suppose. But then once you get done with that, try to, in the best way possible, say, look, I want to provide an API HTTP endpoint for this as a particular implementation detail or infrastructure detail, and then have the tool actually just build that based on the domain model with configuration around what you do and do not want to expose and how you want that interaction to actually occur within code. But not to the point where you're actually having to specify things like, okay, this is a get, like an HTTP get. Like, if you just classify it as like, hey, I want to put a query port on this, or if you could classify an operation as a query or a command, like, the verbs should just be part of the language, right? There's natural things that flow back from that. If you have a operation that is a query function, it's going to be a get, most likely, right? So it's like, I don't know why we need to spend so much time thinking about, the API and the database structure and stuff, when most of that stuff should just be able to they need to be separate, but they should just flow out from the domain, rather than focusing on creating those and trying to use the domain to connect them all together. So, like, it would be kind of cool if you could get down to the fact where you define, your data entities, language, whatever, you define your operations, and then in terms of a spec, and then everything is basically generated on the outskirts of it based on just configurations you provide. And all you're doing is filling in the small details there. And then your actual, where you would really write code is actually just potentially in how you implement the domain logic itself.
It's been working for me. And so this whole thing again is I'm integrating waterfall with the compiler.
Yeah.
And it's a lot easier. It's not as painful. Waterfall is painful when you're doing it in a Word document, in an Excel spreadsheet, right? But it's a lot easier, and you get rapid feedback when you're using the compiler to tell you if logically your mental model of how things are going to work, hence your operations and the language that your operations rely on, if it fits. And your compiler is going to say, yep, nope, yep. And you just keep iterating on it until you have something that compiles and makes sense, even though you don't have any conditional code. And then you do further validation by writing some automated tests. And your automated test is going to cause you to, or influence you to tweak your model again, or your specification again. And then once you start writing your interpreter, then you're going to do your last couple of tweaks. But things are pretty much thought out, and it's again using waterfall, but applying it towards a compiler instead of a Word document.
Yeah, and I think, like I said, I actually jive really well with that idea. And what I'm looking at is does that workflow work within a tool like Darklang?
Now it will. It's doing F# now, but
yeah, but and maybe it's just the way that they're marketing it, because they, it always starts off with like, okay, we're going to make a little API, and it's driven from the fact that you're receiving HTTP messages, versus saying, hey, let's start with a domain concept like a verb or whatever. Here's an operation that needs to be done is add, and then defining the language around that, and then saying, okay, well, what actually needs to be generated? Well, I want to provide a API to this, and then so you that just is a configuration setting that and then you might have to write some mapping code or something like that. But it starts to like, I get to the point where it's like, why do I have to define that I want a RESTful API or an HTTP API here, or a whatever? Why do I have to spend so much time on that stuff instead of just focusing purely in on, what are the operations it provides? What are the data types and entities and domain terms that I want to document? And then just having the tool take those concepts and then just, actually generate those external things for me. Because I hate doing the plumbing on like HTTP endpoints. Like, that's the thing I hate the most about code, because it's like, it's a lot of mapping logic, and it's a lot of just handling the exact same types of things. Like, well, if your HTTP request doesn't map into the command or query parameters that I'm exposing, well, then guess what? You have a bad request. Like, and if you give me an ID to something and it doesn't exist, and the result is it doesn't exist, well, that's going to be a 404, or a 5, these kinds of codes. Or if you want to, return 200 and have that in an application layer, or in a different layer or whatever, that's fine. But yeah, like I said, I feel like I want to make a tool that focuses purely on the domain modeling portion of it, and then has everything else just be, generated off of it, rather than focusing on the tool on how do I build out an HTTP endpoint or whatever. So, and maybe code generation tools mostly do that. but I like the idea of pairing all that with the frictionless, development, even if it's just a rapid prototyping tool. I also like the idea of it being more related to code generation, rather than just hiding all of that from you, which I assume Darklang does. I don't know if you can just get a package that's here's your complete solution in the language of your choice. But
you do code generation, like, is it going to look like Missile or Microsoft Intermediate Language? Like, is it going to be code that is readable, usable? Like, I think that's going to be probably the biggest challenge.
Oh, I think that would be the.
You got to beautify it with formatting.
That would be the point. Is I think what I would do is I was thinking through this, is I would actually, start. You wouldn't necessarily have friction. Use the tool. You define all of this stuff, and then it would generate the code as if I wrote it by hand. So it would be. The point would be to try to make it so that it appears or feels like this is a human written thing.
Oh, okay, so you just do search and replace, and you just swap out markers or values. Yeah,
it'd be template based or whatever. So it's, and then I was trying to think about how do you make that then reverse so that if you could pull it back in the tool, make changes, and then spit it back out, so that you could still do pull requests and process things in that way. Because I think there is value in not hiding code behind a tool. I hate low code solutions for that reason, where they've got these proprietary structures, and you fill in some data and configuration, and it just makes everything happen. But you can't get all the benefits of that you get with being able to do code reviews and having people come in and read it, and then really deviating where you're like, look, I can't do this in the tool. I'm just going to deviate. And I like the idea of having the tool generate code that's human readable and interactable with, and you can actually expand on separately. So maybe the idea is that it's a rapid prototyping tool for your first version of a service, and then after that you go into standard code development. You know what I mean? But it focuses on getting the important stuff down, which is making sure that you have perfect alignment with your domain, the business domain that you're trying to model out and automate. And I think that, like I said, that part is overshadowed by all of the plumbing you have to do just to get the tech to work, which I hate.
Well, you could borrow some of this code. So this was a sync engine thing. And again, it has no clue what the server endpoints is supposed to sync with. It just knows that for it to poll the server, there's going to be a submission that it sends to the server, and it's going to get a response back. And the actual details is, well, here's your endpoint, which is just a string, right? Your submission is something generic. It could be anything. And Odie code reviewed this several days ago, so it's perfect. But that was a joke. But yeah, but this is another example of just hella abstract. Nothing in here knows anything honestly about HTTP versus what any of the other protocols are. It just knows that it's going to have a request has some type of submission along with the endpoint, and that's it.
Here's another question for you. If you do get into this and you find out that everything is literally just CRUD for your operations, do you take any particular actions then based on that? So if it's like, okay, the operation needs to be create entity, read entity, update entity, delete entity, next one, create entity, and that's because it's purely a CRUD app. Do you take a different action with those, or do you model out CRUD and just it's just if there's not a lot of actual domain logic behind it, are you still doing this process?
There's a couple things. One is, even though I know it's mainstream, I really don't like blowing away data. Like, hence the whole event sourcing or event store.
Yep.
So I'm more about read and append, and I try to not entertain update or delete. But let's say that it's full crud and like it is what it is, and the business is perfectly fine with me blowing away data via update. And
Well, I
losing
mean,
it
update and
local.
delete. I mean, it could be just like think about it in terms of, maybe you're sunsetting something, or you're just you're
User
doing a
preferences.
mutation. You're doing a mutation to it, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to throw away something. You're just saying I want the state of it at this given point in time to be something
Yeah.
different. But you might still hold on to what its state was. So you're not necessarily blowing away data. I don't really believe in database deletes for the most part. I mean, I've done them, but I think I'd rather have things like dead flags and stuff like that. But if you're not doing event sourcing, that is. But what I'm saying is those, okay, if you get into the app and it's purely just all operations are just flat data, you create it, you record, you update it, you read it, you delete it, or you set state variables, whatever. There's no other special thing. All you're doing is recording this thing. Do you still manage those operations in here, even though they're just
I
simple?
do. I do.
Okay.
Because there's other things to take into consideration. And it's just my personal opinion. Is I mean, I dealt with this for one of my clients where, okay, does everybody have equal CRUD permissions, or does the admin only have permission to delete or modify, but everybody has permission to read? If so, then do I need a model that in order for you to do a delete or an update, then you must have admin rights, right? And so I'll start. The short answer is, by default, my go-to is to build a specification library and to document all the operations. And if someone isn't terrified of ML, then they have opportunity to look at the specification for the operations that I'm considering and review it, and then tell me if my model isn't quite right. But it's I have a hard time believing that even a basic CRUD business app isn't going to evolve with some complexity once you demo it and you get feedback. It's
Yeah.
always been the case for me, always. So
Yeah, it's simple CRUD app, and then somebody says, well, can you trigger an event when this thing's created and spit it off to this other thing so that this other process can start, this third party thing? And you're like, well, I I didn't actually write the create code, so we'll have to use a database trigger or something. Yeah, okay, I get it. Yep.
I had
Yeah.
one app that was slated to take the boss said like 3 weeks, and I'm like, no. Like I was assuming it would probably take like maybe 4.5 weeks, and based on just the external dependencies that were outside of my control, and then you don't know what you want until you see a glimpse of what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Like all of a sudden, scope just kept on creeping, and what turned out to be something very simple and basic, because the boss literally said, "Scott, this is easy. All I need is blah 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 blah." I'm like, okay. And then, like, once they see it, then they want to add more features to it, or the database. And I've vented to you about how the server is stupid, and now I have to build all this complexity into the client, because the server is literally just a database server, right? It doesn't care about illegal states. It's whatever you send it, garbage in, garbage out. It doesn't care about it. And so, like, and because the CTO owns the server side, I'm forced as the mobile developer to compensate for what the server isn't willing to do. I just find that using this approach just helps me maintain the chaos that is managing the chaos or potential chaos.
Yeah, well, that feeds into like what I was talking about earlier with and maybe I shouldn't say outbound, but more dependency with modeling within an application or whatever, a dependency and that boundary to it. Because what I'll do is if I feel like it's a core part of what the application, the part of it, the domain that I'm dealing with, like it's part of the UI's domain, I would put that in the domain code, the core code. But if it's something that I'm trying to adjust for the lack of capability on the server, but I feel like the server is going to take on that responsibility, or I'll actually put that code in an adapter or within the endpoint library, so I hide it from the application itself. I don't include that data in the core module, because I'm doing this. It's technical debt, really, is what it is, because it shouldn't belong here.
Yeah.
So I'm going to push that to the boundary. That's the way I think of it, is I push it to the boundary, or out to the boundary, and I put it there, but with the idea that this shouldn't be here. It's not part of my application. It's doing it because I have to deal with what I'm given. So, and sometimes that involves like, hey, this thing should give me all the data, but it's not giving me all the data, and I have to go and aggregate the data from some other place for now, while I wait for this thing to get all of those, to catch up to where I'm going. There's a lot of flexibility in separating that stuff out at the boundary and just hacking it together, and then keeping your domain really pure. Maybe is that like an anti-corruption layer? It's probably fairly similar to that idea. Like you've got an anti-corruption layer at the boundary.
Oh, I think when you have an interpreter that implements the operations that you specified, I think it's a form of it, because how else can you get it to compile if your interpreter,
yeah,
it says it's implementing this contract, hence this function type that's declared in your operation spec.
Yeah.
And so, like, some things I just try to do usually is, when I'm defining my operations, as I said earlier, I try to consolidate it to just one parameter. And that parameter, if it's business related, it's almost always a submission of some sort, right? And that submission is usually going to have like some security token or user information that deals with if they're authenticated or not, and the server can decide if it wants to return the error description, or if it wants to return a result of successful but returns none. And then, like, I don't know, I just try to take into account the enterprisey part of these domains without having a proliferation of parameters all in it, because that's something that you could get yourself into. Is you start doing these operations and you start defining, what the core operations are, and they end up taking like 6 different parameters when they could really just be bundled into just one submission. But
yep,
I'm rambling right now.
Oh, cool. I think this is helpful. That main thing about, like I said, the start with the verbs and not the nouns is probably the approach I'm missing right now in the way I'm thinking about stuff. So that's good. Are you going to work on your...
That was a game changer for me. It made things so much clearer. Like when you're just doing nouns, I feel like you're guessing. Like you're trying to model the real world, and that's where I was getting in trouble, because I care more about modeling the actual thing than modeling the rules that thing needs to comply with. And that's what we're programming. We're building a requirement is a rule, I would say.
Yeah.
And that's what we care about. We don't care about things. We care about rules. And so that was kind of a revelation that I had.
You gonna work on your courier or your beach delivery app this week then? Now that you're doing event storing?
That event store was part of it, because I got to port the dependency on a executable running on my local machine to it now pointing to an Azure address that has this event store running on it that I recently just wrapped up with. So yeah, I'm trying to. I think it's been almost 2 years, man. Since I made that declaration to build a mobile delivery app. 2020's been bad for me, but yeah, I'm trying to get back into it. I'm trying to dedicate at least an hour a day. Who knows? It definitely won't be done by January, but maybe by Easter, maybe I'll have some rough form in production with one courier, maybe my girlfriend doing jobs on the beach or something. So
I got it. So you'll be sitting on the beach and you'll be like, I need my girlfriend to bring me a beer or something.
No, I'll be the pimp. I'm like, go serve that person on the beach. Come back with my money. So I'll be rolling up, checking up on her, making sure that she's making the deliveries and she doesn't come short with my money. Which is also a third. That admin app is the third mobile app that needs to. It's going to take into consideration the normal patterns of business activity, and it's going to alert me to significant deviations of activity patterns, so I can figure out if someone's trying to cheat me, or I'll get notified if it's raining in a certain location, and that's why there's not as much business transactions going on in, I don't know, South Beach compared to Fort Lauderdale. Like I'll start getting notifications about things that are irregular, which I'm sure they have to have all that stuff built into Uber Eats and all those other mobile delivery applications when things don't look right and they need to figure out why their money's coming up short. So short answer is, yeah, I'm back on the ball.
Cool. All righty.
All right, Sean, it's been real. So
yep. Have a good week.
Yep.